Welcome to this film, which follows a voyage made in 1962 to the west coast of North America in a general cargo ship. These ships were the world's workhorses before the advent of container ships, carrying every conceivable type of cargo around the world. Each type was designed for a particular service, and they were operated by a multitude of private shipping companies, some with very long histories. In these ships the cargo would be stowed in holds, the number varying depending on the size of the ship. Our ship was operated by Furnace Withy Lines. She was a steamship, or SS, called Pacific Reliance, and weighed some 9,000 tons, and I was serving in her as an apprentice deck cadet. She had 5 holds, 2 forward and 2 aft, with one beneath the central accommodation. Each hold had a set of cranes, known as derricks, each with a capacity of 3 tons, and secured either to the masts or to dummy ones called Samson posts. There was a 25-ton heavy lift derrick at number 2. Some of the holds had upper levels, known as tween decks, which helped with cargo distribution, and also, if required, provided space for refrigerated cargoes or high-value goods. We joined the ship in Salford Docks in Manchester, at the eastern end of the Manchester Ship Canal. These docks were closed in 1982 and have now been redeveloped, with the new home of the BBC to be found there. Our ship is under repair in a dry dock, a basin like this one, which can be sealed and drained to enable the hull to be examined. These docks vary in size and are often referred to as graving docks. You can see the huge gates which separate us from the river behind. Looking down into the dock, we get a very nice view of our huge propeller, and also a glimpse of the welders and fitters who are working to get us ready for sea. Once down at the bottom, we seem somewhat insignificant, with the huge gates and propeller now above us. In the gloom underneath the ship, the welders are securing a new plate into the hull. Not a very pleasant job, working above their heads as they are. In the days of wooden ships, this area, nearest the keel, was known as the Devil, which gave rise to the phrases "the devil to pay" and "between the devil and the deep blue sea." Once repairs are complete, the sluice gates are opened and the dry dock begins to flood, a process which takes several hours to complete. This was a very smelly procedure at the time, due to the heavy pollution of the water in the canal, which sometimes led to the word "ship" in the name being modified by one letter. These heavy baulks of timber are used to line each side when the ship is out of the water, to stop it from falling over. After leaving the dry dock and loading some of our cargo, we head for the open sea down the 36 miles of the canal. It was built between 1887 and 1893 to allow ships to access Manchester City direct, thus avoiding the charges at Liverpool docks, which were felt to be excessive at the time. It generally follows the original courses of the Mersey and Irwell rivers, and uses locks to raise ships by about 60 feet or 18 metres. Astonishingly, it was built entirely by hand. A number of bridges span the canal, such as this one, the Cadishead Railway Viaduct, now derelict. Here we're approaching another bridge, this time one under construction, a bit of a puzzle to us at the time, but which is now doubtless very familiar to the thousands of motorists who thunder across the Thelwell Viaduct on the M6 motorway every day. Although it was never a commercial success, and Salford docks are now closed, the canal is actually still in use, and its current owners, who also own the Port of Liverpool, have announced a huge plan to develop both facilities for modern container transport. Once into the Irish Sea, we top up our outbound cargo, first in Glasgow, where we load a large consignment of whisky, and then in Swansea, before we set out towards our first foreign destination, Bermuda. This tiny island, only 18 miles long, lies over 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic. We had to be careful with our navigation, since it would be very easy to miss it altogether, and we didn't have satellite navigation to help us, just a sextant for observing the sun and the stars. It will take us about 8.5 days at our average speed of 15 knots. The island is protected by a surrounding coral reef, and our approach to Hamilton, the capital, weaves its way through the many reefs and islands in the lagoon. Bermuda has been a British colony since the 1600s and is now a self-governing British overseas territory. Due to its position and subtropical climate, it has been and remains a very popular destination for tourists. Over the years, it's become very intensively settled and expensive, even though its position at the end of the hurricane belt can give rise to some very violent weather. The cathedral dominates the skyline as we pass other ships on the way to our berth. Ahead we have a sight of the Queen of Bermuda, an early cruise ship then operated by our sister company, Furnace Bermuda Lines, until they ceased operations in 1966. We only stayed here just long enough to discharge a small amount of cargo before leaving on our next leg down to the Panama Canal, a distance of 1,650 miles, which took us about 5 days. Before entering the canal proper, we discharge further cargo at Colon, the port of entry for the area, after which we make a quick transit of the bay to the Gatun locks, which mark the start of the canal. Lining up these two lights, known as leading lights, helps us to find the correct approach course to the channel. The locks on the canal, which raise and lower ships 85 feet or 26 metres to the lake above, were one of the greatest engineering achievements of their day, and they're doubled to allow movements in both directions simultaneously. Here an Atlantic-bound ship is just leaving as we approach, but the left-hand gates are open for our entry. The Gatun set have 3 flights on each side, and are fitted with 2 sets of gates at each end for extra security. The crew handle the mooring ropes, which secure us to the immensely powerful tractor units, which are known as mules. 4 of these are used each side, and they haul us through the chambers under the guidance of the pilot. This picture, courtesy of Wikipedia, provides a lovely view of the general layout of Gatun. The locks bring us up to a large lake, named after them, formed by flooding several valleys in the mountains. The formation of this lake was really the key to the successful construction of a canal here, a project which had defeated the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps of Suez Canal fame, who had tried to cut a sea-level canal in the 1880s. A combination of heavy rain, dense jungle and tropical disease combined to thwart this attempt, and it had to be abandoned. After much redesign and political manoeuvring, the United States purchased the concession in 1904, and the canal was finally opened 10 years later in 1914. These islands are just the tops of drowned mountains. The lake provides 15 miles of navigable water, and it leads to the most difficult stretch to build, a slice through the mountain ridge known as the Culebra Cut. This 7 3/4 mile section cost many hundreds of lives, particularly during the French attempt, which are commemorated here by this memorial on the side of the mountain. Despite frequent landslides, vast amounts of earth and rock were removed, much of which was used to create the town site of Balboa on the Pacific side. Our transit takes about 8 hours, and we're now setting out northwards towards Los Angeles, another 3,000-mile run, taking us about 8 days in all. When we enter the waters of another country, our first act is to raise their flag, which my colleague is doing here. This is known as the courtesy flag, and its absence can cause very great offence. As we approach our berth in the harbour, I can't really say that Los Angeles, my first taste of the United States, filled me with any enthusiasm at all for the land of the free, and in fact I formed a very negative view of the country which lasted for many years. However, in addition to visiting a supermarket, a phenomenon quite unknown to us at home at the time, I did very much enjoy a visit to marine land of the Pacific, on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Opened in 1954, 1 year before Disneyland, this was the world's largest oceanarium at the time, and the car park in the background and the throng of visitors attest to its popularity. Its main attraction was its performing killer whales and dolphins, housed in this enormous stadium looming over the whole complex. It also had extensive research and educational facilities. Tourism had yet to take off in the UK, so this was a very new experience for me, even including the well-stocked gift shop. The whales and dolphins were housed in huge tanks, a feature of which was that they could all be viewed in their natural medium, underwater. For me this was a highlight, to be able to watch their power and beauty at first hand. It was an absolute delight to watch the speed with which they would approach their jumps under the surface. The dolphins performed a number of different stunts on cue, which were all carried out with very obvious enjoyment. Interestingly, they can often be seen performing much the same antics in the open ocean, away from the crowds, presumably out of a sheer joy of living. However, perhaps they don't quite reach to this height. The orca, or killer whale, was definitely the star of the show. Here he is, delivering a present to his handler, and further displays followed, designed for our amusement. Once again, some of this behaviour can occasionally be seen out at sea. It was amazing to see this giant creature performing to order, and there was a definite rapport between him and his handler. However, modern research into their intelligence might make one wonder whether these beautiful creatures were actually humouring their trainers for their own enjoyment. This simultaneous jump by the 3 dolphins always brought the show to an end, and it was amusing to note that between shows no above-the-surface activity was ever performed. There was also much of interest to see in further static exhibits around the site, which introduced us to other sea creatures such as sharks, sea lions and seals, whose sinuous grace never failed to impress me, and which is very evident here at feeding time. It was with mixed emotions that I left Los Angeles. Marineland had been a delight, but the rest of the experience had not been pleasant. However, we now set our course for San Francisco, just a day's run of around 360 miles to the north. The Golden Gate Bridge, often shrouded in dense fog, provides a spectacular entry into a huge natural harbour which contains the notorious prison island Alcatraz. Here we were to discharge and load cargo not only in San Francisco itself, but in Oakland, a separate city just across the bay. What a contrast awaited me here! Not only was the city very beautiful and diverse, but its inhabitants seemed to be from another world altogether. The famous cable cars provided a great experience, and took us up into the hills, from which we could enjoy this spectacular view, with the Bay Bridge complex spanning the harbour to Oakland. After a most enjoyable stay, we pushed on up the coast to Portland in Oregon, around 650 miles to the north, and situated up the Willamette River, some 90 miles inland. This river journey was very novel for me, and I suspect also provided much enjoyment for our passengers. Cargo ships at this time often carried up to 12 passengers, the maximum number which was allowed without a doctor. Since air travel was still very new and expensive, these ships provided transport to an extensive range of ports worldwide, as well as supplying round trips of great interest to those wanting a different experience, since the itinerary often changed during a voyage at short notice. The famous Broadway Bridge, spanning the Willamette River, has two counterbalanced spans in the middle which can be raised to allow ships to pass underneath. This type of bridge is called a bascule bridge, and this is still the longest in the world. The famous Tower Bridge in London is another example. The junction between this and the Columbia River made it a good choice for the siting of the city, since the waters provided easy transportation for the area's main resource, timber. The vast forests supplied much of the building material for the development in the region. Associated products of every type soon followed, and here is one reason for our visit, as we load enormous rolls of newsprint into No. 3 hold, amidships under our living quarters. So, back on the river, we retrace our steps towards the open sea, and our northward progression now continues. This section takes us around 19 hours altogether, and we stop briefly at Seattle, before hoisting the Canadian ensign as we enter Canadian waters. Here we will be visiting Vancouver, although other ports were on our itinerary. Vancouver, our first Canadian port of call, was one of the loveliest cities I'd ever seen, and made a very deep impression on me. It's no surprise to learn that it's consistently named among the top cities in the world for its quality of life and ethnic diversity. Passing under the classic Lions Gate Bridge, we enter the main harbour area and approach our berth on the southern side of the large enclosed bay. As with most visitors, I headed straight for Stanley Park, at the western edge of the harbour, and one of the first areas to be explored by the original settlers. It covers 1,000 acres, and unlike most urban parks, much of it remains densely forested, with some of the trees being hundreds of years old. Part of it, however, has been landscaped for public enjoyment, and we are welcomed by the Lumberman's Arch. My visit started on a high note, with a delightful encounter with a remarkably friendly black squirrel, a relatively rare subspecies of the squirrel family, which I'd never seen before, and which kept me amused for some considerable time. Then and now, this superb collection of First Nation totem poles was a huge draw. It was in the process of being moved here when I visited, which explains the empty plinths in the background. These extraordinary creations are unique to this part of Canada. They're carved from red cedar and each carving tells of a real or mythical event. They're not objects of worship, but each carving on a pole has a meaning. For example, the eagle represents the kingdom of the air. The small pole to the right of centre is an example of a house post, and these were used to support the huge roof beams in traditional houses. This one is called the Thunderbird house post, after the image of a mythical thunderbird at the top, and this close-up shows the stunning carving involved. At the bottom is a grizzly bear holding a man. This is actually a replica, and its original is now in the Vancouver Museum. Another very popular venue to be visited was a small zoo, and this newly added exhibit with polar bears was a great draw, although it did have its critics. The public had close access and would unfortunately often throw unsuitable items into the pool for the bears to retrieve, an activity which is hopefully much more difficult to achieve today. Regrettably, at this time, zoos generally still existed largely as a display of animals, although there were some attempts at education. The conservation activities pioneered by Gerald Durrell had yet to become common practice. Although I did have a tinge of sadness watching these beautiful creatures at play, perhaps we should remember that the savage nature of life in the wild also has its drawbacks. Naturally, seals were a much-loved attraction, with their obvious enjoyment of the public attention. Their sinuous and graceful movements were always a delight to see. I find penguins quite irresistible. I did feel, however, that this small enclosure was really inadequate to allow them to display the astonishing difference between their enchanting and somewhat eccentric movements on land and their truly amazing abilities in the water, their natural environment, and where of course they are complete masters. In my present old age, I really am amused to feel entirely in sympathy with this individual, as he shows enormous care in dealing with this tiny step, both in and out of the water. In 1966, the animals were moved to other locations, and the zoo finally closed when the last remaining polar bear, who had not been moved due to his old age, died a year later, aged 36. It was with considerable regret that our visit here came to an end, as we left through the Lions Gate on the start of our return voyage to the UK. The main reason for our visit to this region was its immense forests, and to our right we can see one of the many jetties which handle the resulting huge volume of timber exports. As we head south again for our 11-day run to the Panama Canal, we have a moment to consider the sort of cargo which we carried in these ships. Naturally, the northern regions have produced a large quantity of timber and its associated products, but also different metals such as zinc and lead. Then there were a multitude of canned goods, ranging from fish, especially salmon, to fruit and vegetables. The 'tween decks have been pressed into service for frozen produce, such as peas or soft fruit. We have a large consignment of borax, used in detergents and cosmetics, and of course grain for flour. Add in the personal effects of people on the move, including cars, together with other general goods too numerous to list, and you get some idea of the huge variety of things which we transported. If it needed moving, we carried it. At the Pacific end of the canal there are two sets of locks, the twin flight Miraflores and the single lock Pedro Miguel, separated by a small lake. The mules are again attached to each side and bring us through and up to the lake, which we cross under our own power to wait for our lock to clear. Once the sluice gates are opened, the chamber empties rapidly, but this also highlights one of the potential problems with canal systems in general: the water supply. The Gatun Lake, which supplies the water for the system, looks vast, but these treetops show that much of it is very shallow. Heavy rainfall obviously helps, as do the rivers flowing into it, so there is a relatively constant topping up. However, the rivers bring in large amounts of silt and cause some erosion of the banks, so there is a never-ending program of maintenance and dredging to ensure the uninterrupted flow of traffic. To allow for the increase in the size of container ships, the canal has now had newer, larger locks built at each end, and these use a system of ponds to reduce water wastage. Arriving at the eastern end, we find many ships waiting for the locks, and we have to anchor to wait our turn. It's obvious how busy the canal was then, but it's even more vital to commerce today. With our transit complete, we're back in the Caribbean, setting out on our last leg across the Atlantic to the UK, and our course will take us through the notorious Bermuda Triangle, which strangely never gave us any cause for concern. We're heading towards London, then still one of the busiest ports in the world. The docks lie some 40 miles up the River Thames, and with a tidal range of up to 23 feet, around 7 metres, it became necessary to develop enclosed docks where ships could be worked safely. Over the years, starting with the Surrey Group in the early 1700s, an impressive number were built. Since cargo handling was mainly done by hand, and there were frequent strikes, ships were in port for many days, and such was the pressure for space that we sometimes had to anchor downriver to wait until a berth was free. Entering the Royal Victoria dock via the upstream lock at the west end of the Royal Group, you can immediately see how busy it all was. Every berth is occupied, and every nationality is represented. This ship belongs to Ben Line, a company trading to the Far East. Behind it, one belonging to Blue Star Line, an important trader in frozen meat with Australia and New Zealand, which had its UK base here. Our berth is in the next basin, the Royal Albert Dock, and the entrance is crossed by this road's swing bridge, which had to be opened each time a ship came through. These barges, known as lighters, were sometimes used to unload on the outboard side of the ship. As we enter, one of our passengers watches with great interest. To our left is a ship of the British India Line, once one of the largest shipping companies in the world, trading and carrying passengers to India, East Africa and beyond. To our right is a passenger ship of the famous Cunard Line, which dominated the transatlantic passenger trade at the time and is now world-renowned for its cruise ships. As we were manoeuvring, little did we realize the momentous changes which were already occurring. A combination of larger ships, mechanized handling using containers, and non-union labour meant that ship handling was moving downstream, sounding the death knell of this hive of activity. There can be no better example of the changes that took place here than two photographs of the same area. First, the Royal Group in its heyday, crammed with ships and cranes, and with not a spare inch of room in sight. Just over 20 years later, here is the same area, without a ship or crane to be seen, and who could ever have imagined London City Airport right in the middle? So, in a way, this beautiful sunset which closes our film could also mark the passing of an era of history. But of course the rising sun will usher in a new chapter in the region's future. I hope you found the film interesting, and thank you very much for watching.